Welcome to the wide receiver cornerback matchup grades for week 7. I'm Jason Gilbo at jgilbo11. As always, if you want to check out the written version of this, you can head on over to DaveFantasyCafe.com. If you're a premium subscriber, it is up on the site now. Otherwise, breaking things down here, looking at wide receivers that are in good and average and worse spots this week, and there's kind of not a lot of guys that are in average spots. It's kind of a boomer bust week. You're either in a good spot or you're not. Not a lot of mid-range guys. So when we kind of look at things, this isn't really a thrilling passing week as far as the offenses go. Not a ton of great matchups for some of these offenses. We do get the Sunday night game on FanDuel, which is a good spot for some of those guys. We don't get it on DK. So a little bit disappointing there. But obviously, I think when we look at some of these names in the top tier that are in good spots, we haven't really rostered a lot of the season, or you may have sworn them off already. But, I mean, breaking things down here, there are some names I think you should consider just because the matchups are fairly strong. One of those guys is Robert Woods. Justin Bethel going to be on him unless, he does get benched. I know there was talks of that earlier this week. Bethel's obviously been one of the worst cornerbacks in the NFL this year. He's tied for the most fantasy points per route allowed this year with Terrence Mitchell at Kansas City. Woods, drawing some decent targets. Obviously Watkins is going to be a guy who's not targeted. He gets Patrick Peterson this week. No real use to the offense there, and he really hasn't been at all this year anyway. So when we look at things, Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp should get a bump in targets. Todd Gurley out of the backfield should get a bump as well. He should be, obviously a guy who's going to touch the ball 25-plus times a game, as he should in this offense. But Robert Woods is a decent option, given the fact that he's fairly cheap, 4K on DraftKings, 55 on FanDuel. If you want to go that route, certainly fine. Kind of moving down the list here, Eric Decker, really good spot for him this week. 4,300 on DK, 51 on FanDuel. A pretty promising week of on Monday night for Decker from what you saw. It was 9 targets, caught 7 of them for about 80 yards. Going to get Jamar Taylor this week, 0.48 fantasy points per route allowed this year. That's the third highest among cornerbacks this season. Also allowing a 73% catch rate, also over 2 yards per route covered as well. Decker should see 6+ targets. It looks like Marcus Mariota's 100% healthy this week anyway. A good stacking partner with him and Delaney Walker, because we'll get to Rishard Matthews here in a little bit. But Decker's in a good spot, fairly cheap. I don't mind him as a wide receiver 3 this week. So definitely give him a look, and obviously some consideration too. Zay Jones, going to get Vernon Hargreaves. He's been awful this year as well. With Charles Clay out, Jordan Matthews is pretty iffy. Obviously Jones is a guy who did see an increase in targets just because he was solely basically the only body out there, him and Nick O'Leary. We might see some targets moving his way. I don't think he's a huge touchdown upside guy, but on a PPR site, you can make the case for him. Randall Cobb, another one here, not a bad spot, but obviously I think when we look at the Packers' overall passing game, it's not really exactly all that thrilling. Cobb's just going to basically draw the best matchup of the week here among Green Bay wide receivers against Kenny Vaccaro, who's allowed 0.36 fantasy points per route run this year, also a 71% catch rate. I'm not really all that much on Cobb. It's a good spot if you're kind of going with a different approach this week or building multiple lamps. I don't hate it. I don't know if he's going to find any way into my laps this week, but obviously he's in a decent spot. Tyler Lockett, good spot here against Eli Apple. Eli Apple's been a guy to kind of pick on this year if you want some exposure to the Saints passing game, because not really thrilled with Baldwin's matchup, not really thrilled with Paul Richardson as well. Jimmy Graham is actually the best target there, given the fact that the Giants are allowing the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends this year. But you look at Lockett, cheap guy you can consider this week as a wide receiver 3. Apple allowing 0.35 fantasy points per route run this year. Adam Thielen obviously would get a big bump in targets if Stephon Diggs is out. I still think Thielen's in play either way. Going up against Ladarius Webb, he's allowed a 69% catch rate this year. 0.34 fantasy points per route run. So I think Thielen's obviously a strong PPR play. He's been one of the better, wide receivers graded per PFF this year. I think he's obviously kind of proven that. So good spot for him. Jermaine Kearse, a decent option this week against Xavier Howard. Howard's been a guy, 0.33 fantasy points per run this year, 70% catch rate. Pretty pedestrian numbers at best. Kearse is obviously a guy who's drawn a decent amount of targets on a week-to-week basis. Kind of been a trustworthy stack with McCown in certain weeks. So don't hate that this week. Keep an eye on the weather. Just saw it's going to be a little bit windy down there in Miami. That could downgrade passing games if it does get a little out of control. finally, we kind of get to some bigger names. Those were kind of the last lackluster names of the good matchups. But Des Bryant, good spot here against San Francisco. This is basically the best matchup for the Cowboys, so far this season. Bryant's going to see Dante Johnson a lot this week. He's been, average at best, 0.32 fantasy points per route run, allowing 1.75 yards per route covered. So, good spot for Bryant here, good spot for Zeke, good spot for Dak Prescott. Cole Beasley obviously draws a good matchup. Not necessarily all aboard on him, but basically all of Dallas is sitting pretty right now. Devin Funchess, I like here quite a bit. Kelvin Benjamin looking iffy for week 7. Getting Kyle Fuller for Funchess, not a great matchup, not a bad one either. Allowing 1.6 yards per route covered this year. Like I said, Fuller's not bad, but he's not good. I think Funchess is in play here. Definitely a step above some of these other matchups in the middle tier. Michael Thomas, good spot for him this week, going up against basically Demarius Randall and Josh Hawkins. Just given the injuries, it's been brutal for Green Bay. So good spot for Thomas to kind of get going here. Targets are still been there this year. So I obviously Saints offense expected to really move the ball and put up a ton of points. So going to be looking his way. Julio Jones, obviously been a disappointment. We saw some talks that, they want to get some more targets involved his way. Only saw 4 in the Super Bowl matchup against New England. But when you look at things, Stephon Gilmore, Malcolm Butler, haven't really been all that great this year. New England's allowing, over 90 yards per game to opposing wide receiver ones. They're ranked 31st in DVOA. Julio Jones is a guy that you maybe just completely off of. You're done. You want to see something first. But, the big game is definitely going to come at some point, this season. I think Jones obviously in a potential like a shootout here. This could be the week. As far as some of the other guys go in that game, Brandon Cooks, good spot here. Not going to be shadowed by Desmond Trufant. Trufant's going to see Chris Hogan. Cooks will see Robert Alford for the most part, who's one of the poor cornerbacks. I would have to say that Hogan's wide receiver 1 right now in New England. He's been kind of the guy that's going to see some of the talent. Atlanta ranks 25th in DVOA against wide receiver 2s, which I'm putting kind of Cooks in that spot right now. So Cooks, decent spot if you're playing on FanDuel. Those Sunday night game wide receivers are pretty solid. Hogan, might be moved around enough to kind of stay away from Trufant because it's not looking like a shadow situation right now anyway. So, I do think all 3 are very much in play. In terms of the middle tier, Pierre Garçon, decent spot against Anthony Brown. Brown's been pretty average, 0.31 fantasy points per route run. Jordan Lewis has actually probably been the better corner there. He's going to see Marquise Goodwin. Dallas, not really a great secondary, not really a great defense. I think there's obviously some good potential in the San Francisco side. We know Garçon, George Kittle's another name that we can throw out there as a guy who's going to see some decent targets. So don't be afraid to put some San Francisco guys in that lineup this week. Jarvis Landry looking more and more in play with Devontae Parker's status up in the air for this week. If Parker comes back, he's going to see Morris Claiborne anyway. Buster Screen's going to be the guy on Landry. Screen hasn't been bad this season, but Landry's a guy that's just going to probably see 10-plus targets, and it's not a matchup that I'm just really completely shying away from. Price tag on Landry coming up a little bit. Not really all that thrilling with the 7K FanDuel price tag. 60 on DK. I think with the full point PPR, it'll still be okay. So I don't hate it. Moving down the list here, Cooper Kupp, 4,600 on DraftKings, 58 on FanDuel. Once again, with the narrative of basically taking wide receiver 2s and wide receiver 3s. Against Arizona has been pretty promising this year, just given the fact that they've been willing to score on basically everyone not named Patrick Peterson. You're going to see Tyrann Mathieu. He's been pretty average in coverage this year at best. So a decent spot given the fact that he's been used in the red zone quite a bit as well. Jordy Nelson going to draw Ken Crawley, allowing a 0.35 fantasy points per run. He's also pretty highly graded. Nelson's a tournament play at best because the price is starting to drop on him. He's 6,800 on DK, 7,400 on FanDuel. So it's not a bad spot, but once again, a little bit of a downgrade without Aaron Rodgers. I'm not really thrilled, but I know a lot of people aren't either. So it might make for a little bit low ownership in terms of a leverage play off of some of those other guys, or also possibly a game stack if you do think this one ends up staying close. Last one here in this mid-range, Larry Fitzgerald he was kind of borderline. Nickel Roby's been pretty good this year. 0.18 fantasy points per route run, under a yard per route covered. Those are pretty strong numbers from a guy that they went and traded for. So I'm not, really picking on Fitzgerald at his new prices this week. He's up there, 75 on FanDuel, 73 on DK. A little bit pricey for me than the spot. If Roby can continue, I think it's a decent spot for to kind of shy away from Fitz. So he was one that's borderline. We're going to get into basically the lockdown coverage. Patrick Peterson taking on Sammy Watkins, as I already said. I don't need to say anything more. It's whoever Peterson's on is the guy that I'm not targeting. Devontae Adams in a tough spot this week. Marshawn Lattimore has been pretty good this season, allowing 0.14 fantasy points per route run, under a yard per route covered. Adams obviously a downgrade without Rodgers. I'm not thrilled with Adams here in the spot. Lattimore, once again, I think he's proven to be he's going to be a decent guy here. We continue to see if that stretch continues, but definitely a tough spot for Adams. Tough spot for the Bucs wide receivers this week. EJ Gaines has been pretty impressive this year. Tre'Davious White has been really solid in his rookie year. Gaines going to be on Evans. There is a little bit of a mismatch height-wise, obviously, with anyone that Evans goes up with. Jackson on the other side, seeing White, that's a tough matchup. Both those guys have been phenomenal this year. You look at Buffalo, top 10 in DVOA against wide receivers ones and wide receiver twos. Gaines has been on par with Xavier Rhodes in terms of just fantasy points per route run against 0.15. Looking at Rhodes here, Mike Wall is going to see Xavier Rhodes. No thanks. I don't need to really target that. Joe Flacco and this Ravens offense just really isn't exciting in terms of the passing game. We get to the Steelers-Bengals game. AJ Green obviously has good success against the Steelers in the past. He's going to see Joe Hayden this week. Hayden's, hasn't been bad. 0.15 fantasy points per route run allowed, allowing just 37 yards per game to wide receiver ones. I'm going to get a share or two of Green, but I'm not going all aboard. I think like some people are this week. I just think I'm going to drive a lot of my attention to paying up at running back and using some of those running backs and the mid-range guys that I mentioned above. When you look at Antonio Brown, scheduled to see Adam Jones, it just depends on if Adam Jones plays. Jones has been terrific. Obviously, Cincinnati's been a team that's held Brown in the past, to pretty limited games. And I think a lot of the production is going to come from Le'Veon Bell this week. So I'm not really all about Brown. If Jones does sit, I think that is a big bump to Antonio Brown, and then obviously I'll tick some shares up. But do keep a note on that situation moving forward. I will post in the comments section here whether or not he plays. As far as other guys go, Colts guys, T.Y. Hilton, Dante Moncrief going up against A.J. Bouye and Jalen Ramsey. No thank you there. They've been two of the shutdown corners of the league this year. There's definitely a reason why Jacksonville is, obviously a top three passing defense. Keenan Allen, Doug Baldwin, two guys, in that mid-range that are in, decent price tags, but there's not really good matchups here. Allen going up against Denver, Chris Harris. You look at Doug Baldwin going up against Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie, obviously in the slot. Both those guys have allowed less than 0.2 fantasy points per outrun this year. Not really looking to use these guys. I think you can push off to some of their other directions in the offenses if you want exposure. Like I said, Jimmy Graham, Tyler Lockett, decent plays. Hunter Henry, not a bad spot. He's probably the only guy that I'll look to use from Los Angeles this week. Last two guys here I do want to talk about Rashard Matthews and Jason McCourty, who's been, he's been great this year. PFF's top-graded corner just shut down DeAndre Hopkins for the most part, allowing 0.24 fantasy points per outrun. I like Decker. I like Delaney Walker. That's kind of my exposure. I look for Derrick Henry, obviously, as well, especially if DeMarco Murray's limited. That's my exposure to Tennessee. Matthews really isn't going to be on that list this week. Demaryius Thomas, last guy I do want to talk about, I'm going to have some shares. I'm going to stick with my gut and say he has a decent game. He's going to be shadowed by Casey Hayward. That's not a great spot for him. But he has a lot of pretty pedestrian 0.32 fantasy points per hour run. But overall, he's a solid cornerback. Thomas obviously going to be a clear focus, I think, on San Diego or on Los Angeles limiting Thomas just because there's no Emmanuel Sanders. But targets should be there. I still will have some shares, but probably not as much as I did kind of planned on earlier in the week. So that's going to wrap it up for me. You can head over to dailyfantasycafe.com, check out the rest of our Week 7 content. And if you're playing NBA, we also geared up a little bit of a rocky start to our tools, but we got things kind of back on track and we're rolling through. So any sport that you're playing right now, definitely head on over to dailyfantasycafe.com and good luck this week.